So the Bedouin chose a particular judge who was known very well at the time for his justness. And he took both of them to court. And he said to Ahmad, and he ruled against Ahmad, saying that as far as you were aware, this deformity was not there when you bought the horse. This is your fault, and it's not the Bedouin's fault. And then that's the Khalifa of the Muslims being ruled upon by a judge of the time, and a Bedouin basically defeats him in court, which is something which it's impossible to even consider nowadays, really. It's unbelievable. And Omar was not upset. He said, this is the ruling of the judge, and this is the ruling of the Prophet ﷺ, because of your justness. And he sent him to be the main judge in, I think it was Basra, in Iraq at the time. He said, you have shown the fantastic qualities that we as an ummah need. I'm giving you one of the top positions that are available in the country at the moment. So rather than actually telling him off, he gave him a huge promotion. The second story, this you may have heard before. It's quite a famous story. Ali ibn Abi Talib, when he was the Khalifa of the Muslims, again, towards the end of his time, he was in Iraq, and that's where he was ruling. And he had an incident where, as his army was riding, he had his shield with him. It fell off his horse as they were riding, and he could not find it. It was a very distinct shield because it had certain patterns that were only on his shield. It couldn't have been anybody else's. He then saw he saw a non-Muslim with the same shield later on, and he approached him and said, "This is my shield. It fell off my horse, and I have not found it since. Can I have it back?" The non-Muslim then said to him, "But it's in my hands. It's my shield. How can you prove that it's yours?" And it was at this point that Ali said to him, "Right, we will get a judge to rule over us again." So they went to one of the famous judges. In fact, it was the same judge, because he'd obviously been working in Basra in Iraq at the time. It was the same judge as the one in the Omar case. And he said to Ali, "Do you have two witnesses that prove that this is your shield?" And he said, "Yes, I have so-and-so, who was the servant of Ali at the time, and also my son." In which case the non-Muslim, obviously very aware of the rules and regulations of Islam, said, "You cannot use your son as a witness for a case such as this. He's not a valid witness." Ali responded to him saying, "How dare you say that my son, who has been granted paradise from the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ himself, he said that both my sons, Hassan and Hussein, will be the children of paradise. How could you say that a child or a man of paradise is not worthy enough to be a witness?" At this point, the judge said to him, "He is right. You cannot use your son as a witness regardless of who he is. Unless you have another witness, then this shield belongs to this man, and it will stay with the man." At this point, Ali ibn Abi Talib said to him, "I have no other witness. You can keep the shield." Again, it shows you the justice that was available and the sort of system that was in place at the time to go into things. Now, this man obviously saw the whole incident, and he could not believe himself. He accepted Islam immediately on the spot. He gave the shield back to Ali. Ali gave him the shield when he obviously heard he had accepted Islam. He gave him the shield back, and he gave him an extra horse as a present and said to him, "You are now a Muslim brother. Regardless, I cannot accept the shield back." And this is again the Khalifa of the Muslims at the time. So the highest position available in society. That's more of an introduction to show you what was left after the Prophet ﷺ. What about the Prophet's life itself? Let's go into a few examples of him being a teacher. One of the Sahabi from the migration from Mecca to Medina, called Suhaib ibn Sinan, went to migrate and do the hijrah from Mecca to Medina. Now, the mushrikeen caught him on his way out of Mecca, and they wouldn't let him go until he gave them every single bit of wealth that he had ever owned, which he did. He offered them all his money in return for letting him go, and he came straight to Medina. Now he stopped at Quba, which is a section just outside of Medina, and if you've heard the story of the Hijrah, you'll know that's where the Prophet stopped, ﷺ, as well. He met the Prophet at Quba, and the Prophet ﷺ came to him after his Hijrah, and he said to him, he was very happy to see him, he was very overjoyed to see him, and he said to him, Ya Suhaib, your transaction has been fruitful. Your transaction has been very fruitful, has been fruitful. He said this 3 times to him, which again is reiterating to him that the sacrifice you have just made is a huge sacrifice, but it's well worth it, and what you've done is definitely the right thing. The other important aspect that the Prophet ﷺ, also part of his teachings, I won't go too much into the different stories of how he taught the Sahaba and other things. A lot of information is already, hopefully if you followed the other 3 talks, you would have heard a lot of that information before. And there's so much other material to cover that I don't really want to repeat myself or repeat the speakers again and again and again. But the other noteworthy action that the Prophet took, which is very relevant and very important, is after the Hijrah, when the Prophet came to Medina, the very first thing he did, before he even chose where his house was or where he was going to live, the very first thing that he instructed his camel to do was to find a place for the masjid. Find the place of the centre of that community. And this is what he did. It's about priorities. This is the most important thing in the community. This is where everything will function from. We need to set this up first. And that's what happened. His camel went across and it stopped. The first place it stopped was the place that the masjid was going to be set up. The particular place was bought. It used to be owned by a few orphans. It was bought from them and not taken. And the building pretty much started straight away to build the mosque. It wasn't anything too fancy. It was very simple, but it was more symbolic rather than anything else. It didn't have to be the most expensive structure in the actual city, but it was the fact that it was just in the middle of everything. And you'll see again through the seerah just how important and relevant the masjid really was for everything that the Prophet ﷺ and the companions did as part of their community. His home, yes, he set up to begin with to live with Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He was the first Sahaba that he stayed with. But then once the masjid was set up, his house was literally next to the mosque, if not leading into the mosque. And again, that shows you the symbolic nature of what the masjid should mean to us. In that he was completely attached to the mosque at the same time. It is where all the big gatherings took place. All the talks pretty much took place. It was the meeting point for any incidents that took place, any important incidents. And it was also the overall community gathering area for anything that needed to be discussed, any announcements that needed to be made. That was the meeting point of all the Muslims. And on top of that, because it was so frequently visited, 5 times a day, by pretty much everybody, it was a place that everybody saw each other and were updated on a regular basis as to everything that was going on in the community. Yes, the Muslims were obviously very religious, but they were also extremely aware of what was going on around them. So that's as far as the education, that was the education centre of the Muslims. And that's where I want to leave that particular section and move on to the other ones. We've mentioned a few examples about justice, but what about the justice at the time of the Prophet ﷺ himself? There's the famous story of the woman from Quraysh, from Makhzum tribe, or the Makhzum family, who was caught stealing. Very well-off family. She was caught stealing and brought to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ordered that the law be carried out on her for her hand to be severed. Quite a few people tried to intercede in this matter to stop that from happening, saying that maybe there's a way around this, maybe we can find another solution. And the Prophet said, which is the response that we all expect, and the correct one, was that many communities have ruined themselves in the past by punishing their poor and leaving the rich alone. By Allah, if Muhammad's daughter herself was caught stealing, her hand would have been cut off as well. Which really gives you an indication of just how just it really was. Regardless of this position, the position of this woman in society, regardless of whether she's rich, poor, she was being judged in exactly the same way as everybody else was in that society. There's no rule for one and one for all. It was the same rule for everybody. The other example of the Prophet's justice, ﷺ, was the way he used to rule in general. And what was very admirable was that a lot of people, non-Muslims, used to come to the Prophet to ask him to rule over their judgments, which again is a huge indication of just how much trust people had in him. The Jews especially, every time they had a dispute amongst themselves, they would go to the Prophet ﷺ and they would ask him to rule using their own laws on them, and they would accept his judgment because they all knew that the ruling that he would give would be the most just solution to the matter, and they all trusted his judgment, even though they refused to believe in him. Which again, subhanAllah, is a testament of just really what everybody, even his enemies, thought of him as well. Another incident and another example that I'm going to quickly touch on is the Prophet's uncle, Abbas. After the Battle of Badr, he was one of the hostages that was taken and brought to Medina. And the Muslims, knowing that the close relationship the Prophet ﷺ had with his uncle, wanted to intercede and see if there was a way that they could let him go. The Prophet insisted that the jizya, the tax, not the jizya, sorry, the tax be paid for his uncle as normal and treated as equally as everybody else, because he's not a Muslim and he's been caught and he's in the same situation as everybody else's relatives that have also been caught. Again, it's another example of justice and fairness. Again, there's a lot of examples we can go through with regards to justice. So, moving on to the third section, which is the Prophet, and again, this is a bit of a long one if we start going into everything, about the Prophet's diplomacy, or him as a diplomat. We've mentioned in the past 3 weeks about his religious beliefs, his relationships with all his families, his relationship with Allah. But what about, and this is really the test of character of a person, of not just knowing your religion really, really well, but also being aware of your surroundings and being aware of what the rest of the community and the world is like at the moment. And the Prophet, without a doubt, is one of the best diplomats that has ever existed on this earth, subhanallah. The best example of this was when he first came to Medina. I don't know if many of you know much about the history of Medina before it became the centre of the Muslims. But Yathrib used to consist of obviously the tribes of the Jews that used to be there. But apart from the Jews, there was two main tribes. There was Al-Aws and Al-Khazraj, who were the two main tribes of Medina at the time. And they were not united. They had big differences between them. They were always constantly battling, and they were very tribal. The first thing that the Prophet did when he came to Medina was to sit down with both of those tribes and put together the constitution of Medina, which is something that was pretty much unheard of at the time. He instilled unity amongst them. I mean, there's brotherhood unity that you can instill, obviously, through religion, inshaAllah, but also you've got to take that one step further. And that's exactly what the Prophet ﷺ did. He sat down with them and they developed a constitution of how the Aws and Al-Khazraj should live, as well as the Muslims in general in Medina, and how they can all live together. And this was written, it was heavily discussed, it was written, and it was agreed upon by everyone. And you can look through the rest of the seerah and see how well it was stuck to, because it was adhered to word for word, and it really helped give everybody the confidence that there are genuine rules and laws that exist here that everybody will follow. If something wrong was to happen, if someone was to do something that was out of character or is not acceptable in this society, they will be punished for it, and something will happen.